There comes a moment in every parent's life when the dynamic with their children begins to change. After decades of nurturing, mentoring, and making sacrifices for them, something shifts. Perhaps they no longer heed your guidance. Perhaps they trivialize your perspective, or maybe they speak condescendingly to you. Or worse, make you feel like you're a burden. This can be deeply painful. When your children start showing less respect than you deserve, you might experience frustration or anger. You may want to remind them of all your sacrifices and years of putting them first. However, responding with anger won't resolve the situation. It often exacerbates it. Instead, there exists a more effective approach to regain their respect without confrontation, arguments, or harboring resentment. This guide offers 6 strategies for parents facing disrespect from their children. These approaches involve subtle but powerful adjustments in how you respond, which can fundamentally transform how they perceive you. While some suggestions might be unexpected, they aim to help you reclaim your position as a respected and valued figure in your children's lives. The first action is to stop seeking your children's approval. A common mistake aging parents make is trying too hard to please their children. You might find yourself accommodating them excessively, agreeing when you'd rather decline, and prioritizing their needs above your own, hoping that your efforts will earn their appreciation. However, the painful reality is that constantly seeking their approval actually diminishes their respect for you. Respect isn't gained through self-sacrifice, but through self-respect. When you consistently yield and compromise to maintain harmony, you're inadvertently teaching them that your feelings are secondary. Once they adopt this perspective, taking you for granted becomes effortless. Consider Margaret's story, once a strong, independent woman who, as she aged, began deferring all decisions to her children. She rearranged her life around their needs, suppressed her opinions, and even tolerated disrespectful behavior. Her motivation was to preserve family unity, but the outcome was quite different. Her children ceased to value her input, viewing her as someone who would always accommodate, agree, and remain silent. What she believed was peacekeeping actually resulted in the loss of her voice and authority. If you're experiencing disrespect from your children, the initial step isn't demanding respect, but rather ceasing to act as though you require it. Establish boundaries, say no when necessary, and express your thoughts even when they might disagree. When you begin respecting yourself, they'll perceive you differently, and eventually, that respect will be reciprocated. The second action is to lead by example rather than engaging in arguments. When your children dismiss your views, interrupt you, or treat you disrespectfully, your instinct might be to argue, remind them of your contributions, and insist they listen. However, this approach rarely succeeds. Reflect on when you last convinced someone to respect you through confrontation. Respect isn't won through words, but earned through presence, how you carry yourself and respond when others test your patience. Responding to disrespect with anger only confirms their belief that they have influence over your emotions. Take Frank's example, a retired teacher who had commanded respect in the classroom throughout his career. At home, however, his adult children treated him as an afterthought, ignoring his advice, dismissing his concerns, and sometimes even mocking his attempts to correct them. Initially, he responded with arguments, trying to prove he deserved their respect. But the more he fought, the more the situation deteriorated, creating a cycle of resentment and diminished respect. Eventually, Frank made a significant change. Rather than arguing, he began truly listening. He stopped trying to earn respect through words and instead carried himself with the natural dignity of someone who already commanded it. He spoke with calm wisdom, without needing to win every exchange. Gradually, his children took notice. They observed a man who didn't desperately seek their approval or feel compelled to prove himself, simply a figure of quiet strength. If you face disrespect from your children, don't engage in battles for their respect. Instead, demonstrate what respect looks like through your self-treatment. Maintain your dignity, speak confidently, and never descend to responding in kind to disrespect. When you stand firm with grace, they will sense it, and eventually they'll follow your example. The third action is to withdraw your emotional dependence. A difficult lesson as you age is recognizing that you cannot rely on your children for emotional fulfillment. While you may deeply love them and desire their love and respect in return, the moment they sense your need for validation, the relationship's power dynamic shifts. People, including your own children, respect those who maintain emotional independence. When you depend on them for validation, affection, or attention, it creates pressure. Rather than feeling grateful, they begin to feel burdened, potentially responding with withdrawal, impatience, or irritation. The more desperately you seek their love, the less freely they offer it. Consider Helen's story, a generous mother who had devoted everything to her children. As they grew older and became occupied with their own lives, she found herself anxiously awaiting their calls. When they didn't reach out, she called them repeatedly, expressing how much she missed them and wished for more visits. Instead of strengthening their connection, this behavior pushed them away. Her calls became perceived as obligations rather than welcome interactions. Then Helen changed her approach. She stopped waiting and calling first. Instead, she focused on her own fulfillment, pursuing new interests, socializing with friends, and prioritizing her happiness. Surprisingly, her children began calling more frequently and respecting her time, viewing her as someone with a rich, independent life. The principle is straightforward. The less you depend on your children for fulfillment, the more they value your presence. When you demonstrate your ability to thrive independently, they develop genuine respect for you based on admiration rather than obligation. The fourth action is to establish and enforce boundaries. A primary reason children lose respect for their parents is because parents permit disrespect. If you allow your children to speak disrespectfully, dismiss your views, or treat your time and feelings as insignificant, they will continue doing so, not because they're unkind, but because people, especially family members, treat you according to what you tolerate. Setting boundaries doesn't necessitate estrangement or conflict. It means calmly yet firmly deciding what behaviors you will and won't accept, and crucially, enforcing those boundaries when crossed. Consider Robert, a retired businessman who had managed a company with discipline and confidence but struggled to apply the same principles with his adult children. Robert's children would interrupt him mid-sentence, dismiss his concerns, and criticize his lifestyle choices. Initially, he tolerated this behavior, believing confrontation wasn't worth the effort. However, he gradually realized that each time he remained silent, he reinforced the message that their disrespect was acceptable. Finally, Robert changed his approach. When his son interrupted him, he calmly stated, "I'll resume speaking when you're ready to listen." When his daughter dismissed his opinion, he replied simply, "You don't need to agree with me, but I do expect respect." When they continued testing his limits, he made it clear that if they couldn't show basic respect, he would limit his time with them. The result was transformative. Initially, they resisted these new boundaries, but over time, they recognized their father wasn't yielding. They saw that he valued himself enough to require respect, which ultimately led them to offer it. If your children don't respect you, ask yourself whether you're enabling this behavior. Without established boundaries, they won't create them for you. And if you don't advocate for yourself, no one else will step in to do so. The fifth action is to stop giving without appreciation. One of the fastest ways to lose respect is to continue giving to those who don't value your contributions. As parents, we often fall into this pattern without realizing it. Giving our time, energy, and support even when it goes unacknowledged is taken for granted or met with entitlement. However, when you continuously give to someone who doesn't appreciate it, you don't cultivate love or respect. You build expectation. They begin to view your kindness not as something valuable, but as something they're entitled to receive. When you eventually stop, rather than feeling grateful for what you've provided, they feel inconvenienced by what they're no longer receiving. Consider George's experience. A father who had always been generous with his children, providing financial assistance whenever needed, dropping everything to help them, and rearranging his life to accommodate their needs. Instead of gratitude, he received complaints. They didn't express thanks but expected more. Most disappointingly, when he finally needed their help, they were unavailable. Eventually, George changed his approach. He stopped overextending himself, ceased offering help before being asked, and began saying no when necessary. Initially, his children were frustrated, unable to understand why he wasn't accommodating them as before. Over time, however, something changed. They began valuing his time and appreciating his efforts because they realized his generosity wasn't unlimited. It was a gift, not a guarantee. If you feel your children don't respect your time, effort, or kindness, step back and ask yourself if you're giving excessively. When you demonstrate that your generosity depends on receiving respect, people will begin treating it accordingly. The sixth action is to build a life independent of your children. One of the most effective ways to regain your children's respect is to show them that your happiness doesn't revolve around them. As parents, it's natural to devote ourselves to our children and make them the center of our universe, but this dynamic shifts as we age. If you've spent your entire life prioritizing them, they may begin viewing you as someone without other interests or pursuits. People respect those who possess their own purpose, interests, and sense of fulfillment. If your children perceive that you depend on them for entertainment, validation, or meaning, they might feel suffocated or, worse still, view you as someone lacking an independent life. Consider Eleanor's story, a widow in her late 70s who, after her husband's passing, channeled all her energy into her children's lives. She checked on them constantly, offered unsolicited advice, and expected them to fill the void left by her husband. However, rather than strengthening their connection, this approach drove them away. Their visits became less frequent, their calls shorter, and Eleanor experienced greater loneliness than before. Then she made a transformative decision. She joined a book club, began traveling with friends, and volunteered at a local community center. She stopped placing her children at the center of her universe, and remarkably, they began reaching out more frequently. They became curious about her activities, admired her independence, and respected her autonomy. If you find your children aren't respecting you, consider whether they see you as someone with a rich, meaningful life, or as someone merely waiting for their attention. When you demonstrate that you are truly living rather than merely existing, they will perceive you in an entirely different light. In conclusion, respect isn't something you can demand from your children. It's something you inspire through your conduct, boundary setting, and lifestyle choices. If they've begun treating you with diminished care, consideration, or respect, don't waste energy on anger. Instead, modify your approach. Stop seeking their approval, as the less you need it, the more freely they'll offer it. Lead by example, since your dignity communicates more powerfully than words. Release your emotional dependence, because greater self-sufficiency earns greater respect. Establish boundaries, since people will only treat you as well as you require them to. Cease giving without appreciation, because unacknowledged generosity loses its value. Most importantly, cultivate a life beyond your children, because people respect those with personal purpose, joy, and fulfillment. If you implement these strategies, a remarkable transformation will occur. Your children will begin to see you differently, not as someone awaiting their attention, but as someone who naturally commands respect through their authentic self. Eventually, that respect will return to you, not because you demanded it, but because you earned it through your actions and approach to life.